Hey moms, looking for some lighthearted guidance on this crazy journey we call parenting?
Join me, Sabrina Kohlberg,
And me, Andy Mitchell, for Pop Culture Moms,
where each week we talk about what we're watching
and examine our favorite pop culture moms up close to try to pick up some parenting hacks along the way.
Come laugh, learn, and grow with us as we look for the best tips.
And maybe a few what not to do's from our favorite fictional moms.
From Good Morning America and ABC Audio.
Pop Culture Moms. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we're going to just be talking about the Depression for a bit. That's it. Both in our real lives and historically. It's just depression all the time. All the way down. My name is Patrick. With me, as always, is Mackenzie.
Well, we're going down the rabbit hole, and it's surprisingly, things have not changed.
It's just a depression with a new
Everything's awful.
No, not everything's awful. The manifesto we're reading today is all right.
That's true. The manifesto is
although it came out in an awful circumstance. Whatever.
Yeah, but that's fine. Listen. Oh boy, I'm tired. Listen.
Yep.
Hard times breed strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times.
You know who says that? Weak men.
Men who aren't on that grind every day. Listen, if you want to be a real alpha male, here's what you gotta do. You gotta take up the John A. MacDonald regimen. Glass of whiskey when you wake up, cigar for breakfast.
All the time.
Marry your, his cousin?
Yeah, it's like first cousin, second cousin, whatever, some relation, you know. Just, pull yourselves by your bootstraps, grind set all the time. Yep, and build trains.
Because you can definitely do that. Building yourself by your bootstraps is totally possible and not a lie that's been packaged and sold to you for your entire lives.
Let's talk about the Depression.
Let's go, baby! Woo! Wait, my depression, your depression.
I think. Well, let's talk about yours today. Tell me about your dreams back. First of all,
my dreams is where political options are in a bunch of idiots. I'm just saying, like, I look at the current landscape of our options and choices for the Canadian government is a goddamn joke right now. Jagmeet Singh decides to dissolve the government. And then, he comes back and says, oh, he's going to support Trudeau. No wonder nobody votes for you, my dude. You're a loser.
It's a shockingly good segue into today's topic, right? Because we're basically talking about the foundations of that party when they were still cool and rad.
It's cool. Yep. Yo, the socialist, the NDP were at their greatest when they had not just health care, not just social care, they had mole care. Best
out of
ad
10.
Ever. Best ad ever. No, but we've got who do we have? We have Mr. Loser doesn't know which party to pick. Mr. Loser that got divorced and won't step down now. And then Mr. Cryptocurrency economy future loser Pierre Poilievre.
Career politician who pretends not to be a career politician.
It's all just the worst. I hate it.
It's all spectacle, and I love it. It's all bullshit. Yay!
None of it matters.
Well, I
was explaining, and this will segue a little bit into what we're going to talk about later, but because, I'm a teacher, so part of that is teaching governance and politics and all that, so I have to teach, I'd always give a brief overview of the political spectrum, blah, 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 and a lot of time the kids are, I'll talk about the different types of government, and then they'll sort of be like, oh, yeah, but these guys believe this, and this party believes that. I'm like, guys, you're trying to imagine that, these parties are so vastly different and far apart, when the truth is they're, a centimeter apart, genuinely speaking. Most of them are just none of them, and yeah, but these liberals want to give away all their money, a bunch of socialists, blah blah. I'm like, no, they're not. They're really not, you guys.
Look, we shouldn't take necessarily our political cues from memes, but it is a rapt one where it's on the one hand you have conservatives who just want to bomb third world countries for oil. And then you have liberals who want to bomb third world countries for oils, but they do it with a gay flag on them, on their bombs.
Yeah.
which is a bit oversimplified, which is the point of a meme, but it's still it gets kind of to the heart of what you're saying in this case. And I only speak in memes, so whatever.
Yeah, well, listen, we're Gen Z. We only speak in memes. It's all we're allowed. Well, sorry, we're both in that weird millennial/Gen Z world of tomfuckery where we don't know what we are.
It doesn't matter.
Nothing matters. Galileo. Figaro, please let me go.
So, anyway, getting into the episode.
We're talking about the Socialist Manifesto of Regina. Is it Regina or Regina? I can't remember.
Regina.
Sorry.
No, but I think we should
the
go
Socialist
with Regina.
Manifesto birthed out of Regina.
No, I think for the entire episode it's going to be Regina, because that sounds like something that would come out of Regina.
This is the level we're working at here, people. But you know what, folks? Today's a great day because today's one of the few days that I could say I actually did the reading for this episode. It's not me like very casual, like very quickly skim reading while Patrick talks for 20 minutes and then I forget what question he was asking.
Makes you feel better. I also forget the questions I ask. It happens to my students all the time.
Yeah. Have you heard of the podcast Smartless? I think
we've talked about it before.
Jason Bateman. Yeah. You're like Jason Bateman. He will ask just like these super like long-winded questions, and it's like there's a great question in there, and there's like really great. It just takes him so long to get through all the build-up. I feel like it's a little bit the same with you. Like you have these great questions, and then there's just a little too much build-up. I'm like, what the fuck are we right now?
Where are
Meanwhile, we? I'm more like Will Arnett, and I'm more just like, what the fuck, guys? What the actual like? I'm just swearing all the time, being really crass. It's great.
Basically, you can imagine this episode as part 2 of our Depression series. Where
I love that that's what we're calling it. Part 2, Depression Boogaloo.
Part 1 was like the general overview. Part 2, I guess we're going to talk more about some of the responses to the Depression on the ground level. And part 3 is going to be more on the political level. So we're going to talk about Prime Minister Bennett and his response, and a little bit later come back to William Lyon Mackenzie King and his response at the end of the Depression. So as Mac was saying, the main reading that we did for today was the foundational document for what we now know as the NDP, right? The Jagmeet Singh's party. At the time when they actually stood for more than just liberal policies, but with an even gayer flag, I guess, on it. Which means nothing to anyone. It's a joke for no one.
Guys, gotta throw off your shackles.
With flair.
With flair. You can keep my shackles, though. I'm happy in bondage.
But basically, we're going to talk about 3 parts here. One, the Regina Manifesto, as you so.
Sorry. This is. God, I'm sorry. It's just like when we have these deep political episodes, I can't help but laugh because it's all so stupid.
So this should not be a joke, and yet it's one of the funniest things I've heard all day. It's just the brutal mispronunciation of a major town.
Regina.
So we're going to talk about that manifesto, the early days of the party that it was foundational to, which at the time was called the CCF, the Commonwealth Federation, Co-operative Commonwealth Federation, and finally some of the more active attempts that people in the 1930s took in order to get change done in the Great Depression era. Namely, the most famous one being the On-To-Ottawa Trek, which culminated in the Regina riot. Yeah. Which we also have like a short story about. But
love our rioting.
Yeah, absolutely. Our Maurice Richard riots, our Regina riots.
Okay, I'm just saying, are we covering the Maurice Richard riots?
We'll have to.
We'll have to. They are the precursor to the Quiet Revolution, Patrick.
I think there's a minor case to be made for that. A very, very minor case.
Maurice Richard was famously a very active political mind.
He really is the person who made sports political.
Yeah, definitely wasn't all the black people trying to get into sports.
Just the entire history of sports going back to ancient Greece.
Yeah. Going back to ancient Egypt. Never mind that marathon. Okay, anyway.
Doesn't matter. So,
Just
yeah,
like
like
this
we were saying,
manifesto.
the manifesto. It's called the manifesto, but it is basically the foundational program of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation.
You know what, Patrick? What is a
And
manifesto? For my mother Elise at home, what's a manifesto?
I guess the most simple way to explain it is a political statement, but not just any political statement. It's a political statement that's meant to actively rally people to a cause in a very popular and impactful fashion, right?
Mm.
I don't know if you would add on to that, like very brief definition, but that's how I kind of
Yeah,
imagine
well,
it.
because I just looked it up, and it's a public declaration of policy and aims, especially one issued before an election by a political party or candidate.
Okay,
And I think,
interesting.
yeah, I think I like that. Just I think the most important part of that, a manifesto really is just a public declaration of your policy and what you want to do. Because I don't think you technically have to be political with it. Like, because different places can have manifestos, and I don't know if that's because they've just co-opted the word because it sounds like a good solid word to use that makes you sound all official. Manifesto, sounds very like nice, strong. But I do think there is some truth. I think it much has a much larger political history than anything else.
Yes, absolutely. And like because it is public, often it naturally delves into the political, right? By the very fact that you are in launching this idea into society, right? And people do with it what they will.
Yeah.
Um,
To give examples, like
mhm.
manifesto is not policy itself; it is the ideas to make a policy. Like
Yeah,
Make
exactly.
America Great Again technically is a manifesto.
I guess so, right? But then what's the difference between a manifesto and a slogan? Because I would consider
Well,
that a
because he has
slogan.
so I guess I mean more like the policies underneath the idea of Make America Great Again. That's a manifesto.
Yeah. Okay,
Building a
that makes
wall,
sense.
the deportation, like all that sort of stuff.
Right.
Drill,
Okay.
baby,
Yeah.
drill.
Yeah, exactly. So there are some very popular manifestos, of
Communist
course.
Manifesto, baby.
Exactly, which as you were
The
saying,
most
like
popular manifesto, arguably, in the world.
exactly, it's meant to be an extremely readable one, right? For a class of people that at the time were not, particularly well versed
Hey, I've
in
started reading it in my free time now.
cool.
Yeah, when I'm on planes and stuff.
That's great. What do you think of it so far?
It's okay. I haven't gone too far
Okay.
into it.
Okay.
I mostly just read it until the plane gets in the air and the online entertainment comes online, and then I can watch movies again. Which I guess just shows how much the capitalists are winning.
Like regardless of your thoughts on the ideas, it is a really good example because it condenses down that what that party was at the time into something very accessible, right, to the masses, to the point that there are millions of copies sold and it literally changed the world, right, in this very specific instance. But there are, manifestos on all sides of the political spectrum. Mussolini had a manifesto, right? That was again very popular in Italy at the time. So the manifesto, especially I think in the 1920s and 30s, when we're talking now, I think was a very popular medium, right? Much more than it is today. I don't know if I don't see many people writing manifestos anymore, or maybe I just don't engage with them as much. But I feel like it's not as much of a popular medium. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess it's because we live in the internet age where like manifestos are not as much of a thing anymore. But
I think the issue is they become so much of a thing now that it's become diluted.
oh
Because
yeah,
like
okay.
restaurants have manifestos now, and it's like, guys, you're just laying out like you're gonna give good food to people.
Yeah.
Cool. This ain't the fucking like Michelin star restaurant.
Your
Put the
manifesto is
burger
your
on the plate.
menu.
Yeah. Jesus Christ. I hope we don't have any restaurateurs in our audience.
I'm happy to be proven wrong, but come on. Like you said, just give me your burger. It's fine.
Give me your artisanal Reuben sandwich or whatever. And I think that's the real issue with the idea of a manifesto, is that it's lost all value as a word because again, it's like so many of these things that try to be counterculture or counter society, it just gets adopted into society culture eventually.
Exactly.
So you can't like, and it's the catch-22 of you want more people to adopt it, but then by adopting it and making it into culture, it no longer becomes part of counterculture, so it's no longer like against the establishment.
It's as good of a way of saying as any. So the manifesto itself that we're talking about here, the Regina Manifesto, it's basically 14 points with brief elaborations on what those 14 points are. That was basically a call to action both to form the Co-operative Commonwealth Federation and a set of ideas that hopefully would get Canada out of the Depression, basically by bringing about socialism. That's basically what they were going for, right? Is democratic socialism, and
Some
just
things more successful than others.
Sure, exactly. And so I would argue that the Co-operative Commonwealth Federation is probably one of the most successful modern parties in Canada, because I wouldn't consider like conservative and liberal as modern parties because they've been around forever, but as far as relatively contemporary, I would say the CCF is probably one of the most successful ones. Most of the things that we associate with the good parts of the Canadian political and social sphere were started, a lot of them by the CCF, like healthcare.
Well, I mean, we'll get into it, but healthcare is one of them. The privatization of certain things like transportation, communication, and then I saw energy. I'm like, oh, that's just Hydro-Quebec.
Exactly. Yeah. They didn't start Hydro-Quebec itself, but yeah, that idea was
there.
Yeah.
And that's often like one of the strongest parts of Canada.
Yeah.
Or even something like the CDC.
Right, exactly, which would have started right around this time, actually. Yeah.
Which, the current winning political candidate wants to dismantle.
I love it. It's great.
It's great. We love taking away the voice of the people.
Look, I have my problems with the CBC. Fine, whatever. Not a lot of people listen to it, but it has an extreme influence. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
It was never meant to be this highly profitable. It doesn't matter. So the manifesto, it begins with, I think, a pretty clear and concise explanation of what they were going to elaborate on. They do what we tell our students to do in essay writing, which is to clearly set out their goals from the start in the introduction,
their thesis
which is, we aim to replace, in all caps, the present capitalist system with its inherent injustice and inhumanity by a social order from which the domination and exploitation of one class by another will be eliminated, in which economic planning will supersede unregulated private enterprise and competition, and in which genuine democratic self-government based upon economic equality will be possible.
I love it.
Socialism. Yep. That's it. But it is interesting.
What do you define as the difference?
The way I kind of see it, obviously the differences have varied over time. Mm-hmm. What a lot of people see as the major differences is that socialism is one step towards communism, whereas socialism, for example, still has things like the state, which provide regulation, right? Like they're calling for in the CCF manifesto here. But communism is the abolishment of the state. Right, would ultimately lead to the abolishing of the state. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like the major step between the two, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, has never been achieved in the contemporary world, so to speak. Right? But whatever, that hasn't stopped people from trying. So yeah, which is why I would call this socialist, because they're not saying that there shouldn't be a state, right? They're literally referring to a genuinely democratic self-government. Self-government in this case, I think, refers to two things: both national self-government, right, which Canadian things for Canadians, whatever, but also actual democracy, where people get their voices heard more, right, or have their voices heard. Which, say what you will, our democratic system has, its advantages and all that. A lot of people feel that they are not actually heard in the political sphere, right? Which is
that's how we got to where we are today.
Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to add on to that, but
bad communication is the root of all problems.
Okay, there's your manifesto.
Yeah, my manifesto genuinely would probably be based on the idea of better communication.
I don't think that's a bad manifesto at all. Yeah. So before we get into some of the points, because I don't know about you, but I have some interesting points to kind of bring up about the manifesto. But I do want to mention that despite being attached to the Co-operative Commonwealth Federation as a party, the actual move towards that party being established and the manifesto itself was spearheaded by two professors, one of them a historian called Frank Underhill, who would later turn a little bit more liberal than socialist after the Depression, and a guy who we've talked about on the show before, F.R. Scott, right, who is a poet and law professor at McGill. And they had formed during the Depression a group, a kind of think tank, if you will, called the League for Social Reconstruction, which were basically setting out policy that people could try to follow, right? Governments or other institutions. And, as a think tank, the CCF kind of became the vehicle for their ideas. And so the League for Social Reconstruction is kind of the think piece, if you will, behind the CCF, at least for a while during the Depression. The League for Social Reconstruction would kind of dissolve itself, but it's still interesting to note that that was the idea behind it. Okay. Did you have anything that you wanted to highlight about the manifesto from what you've read of it, or like anything that stood out to you as particularly interesting?
Just sort of as we sort of mentioned earlier, it's actually kind of interesting how prescient this manifesto was with some of its ideas, and how they became sort of part of a modern Canada. Again, the sort of the public, or the turn from certain things from private to public, the insurance that Canadians would act a certain way in the economy and do certain things, these very sort of strong beliefs that people had. I think it is quite interesting to see the fact, or consider how while we know you should never fully wholeheartedly adopt something, you should always just take bits and pieces from it that work, pull all the levers a little bit. I think this is a very good example of that.
But you're referring in this case to point 3, which would be social ownership, right? The socialization of transportation, communications, electric power, and all other industries.
Yeah. In services essential to social planning and their operation under the general direction of the Planning Commission by competent managements. Public utilities must be operated for public benefit and not for the private profit of a small group of owners or financial manipulators. And so, not all this was taken to full effect, but there are certain parts of it, and we've seen that it works.
Quebec's a really good example.
Yeah. Transportation is still very transportation, but we're not going to talk about the railways. It's fine.
For sure.
But again, electric power, is actually a very good point to be brought up there.
Yeah. Interesting that they're not calling for every single thing to be made public, but basic necessities are what they see as the upcoming basic necessities of the future, which I think is pretty accurate as far as transportation, communications, and electric power. These are things that we're going to need for the foreseeable future. But also things like basic food products, like milk distribution, bread. They refer to coal and gas, which does date the manifesto a little bit, but whatever. But things like this, like milk and bread, essential food products. I think that's a very interesting idea, which I know some other countries have put significant investment into making affordable, at the very least, for every person, if not socializing it entirely, but definitely putting money so that people can afford at least these basic necessities. So again, it's one of those things that is technically possible. And I do find it interesting that in these early days of this manifesto, that's kind of what they were trying to go for. Right? So yeah, great. I like that one too. I do find it interesting as well to see what didn't happen, right? Or the certain things like a higher emphasis on agriculture, right, and farming conditions.
That never happened.
No, exactly. And funny enough, that's one of the reasons why in the prairies we see such discontent now, right? Is because there was not as much emphasis.
There's no change for farmers.
No change, very little change for farmers, and what change there is doesn't benefit them as much as maybe we should. Right, exactly.
I think we forget, we kind of need food. We kind of need food, you guys.
Not only do we need food, but especially in the world that we live in, to come back to your point on it being prescient, especially in the 21st century world, understanding new ways of agriculture and trying to figure out like
Yeah.
new ways of food production is an extremely vital part of future society, right?
Well, again,
And
and that
we're
just
just
sort
kind
of
of
shows the example, like Quebec doing it better because they actually have
Mhm.
taken into effect some of those new technologies, like the hydroponics and all that sort of stuff. I swear to
Absolutely
God,
not
if it
necessarily
wasn't
on a wide scale, but yeah, absolutely.
no, but but that's how these things start. They always start pilot programs, and then you see, they're seen as profitable, and then blah 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 blah. Today, if it wasn't for the goddamn language problems, Quebec would be a great place to live. I swear to God, that's the only thing. Well, not the only thing, but yeah. I'm not gonna get more into it.
We'll get to it. I'm sure we'll have whole episodes where we'll be able to get into
Quiet
it.
Revolution, here we come, baby. It starts with
Um,
a pebble named Maurice Bouchard.
there was absolutely no French discontent before Maurice Richard in the 1950s.
No, let's just put Maurice's in Quebecois discount. Maurice Duplessis, Maurice Richard.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. I'll ask some of my students named Maurice what they feel of Quebec nationalism. Without going into every 14 points, right? Some of the most important ones that were obviously brought up, again, were like socialized health services, which we'll come back to, but is one of the advancements of the later CCF. By the way, like later in his life, and I want to do a whole episode on Tommy Douglas because he's a very interesting person, but later leader Tommy Douglas of the CCF NDP would be the first to try out socialized healthcare in Saskatchewan. Right. And because it was such a successful pilot project, that's when it led to everything else in Canada, everywhere else in Canada having some form of it. So, these ideas were at least taken into consideration, but others like taxation and public finance, or even some of the things like on social justice, were maybe not as taken into consideration, or even labor laws. Labor laws have ebbed and flowed in Canada, but to the extent that they're talking about it in the manifesto, not necessarily ever came to its full realization, right? And by the way, you were talking about the Communist Manifesto earlier. That labor code point straight up reference to it, right? The specter of poverty and insecurity which still haunts every worker, though technological developments have made possible a high standard of living for everyone, is a disgrace which we must remove from our civilization. So the reference here to specter and haunting is literally the opening of the Communist Manifesto in this case. But I do think it is interesting, and still a point that you hear from a lot of people almost 100 years later. Feel like we live in a world where we have every means necessary to make everyone, be able to live comfortably, and we do. Right. Take a second to think about why that is. It's not happenstance. Obviously, I'm like oversimplifying their point here, but that's kind of what they're saying. And yeah, good for them for calling it as it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, some of the stuff is like less interesting and more political. Like, oh, we propose like amendments to the British North America Act and all of that, which I'm like, yeah, okay, good for you. And some things are pretty good, like the external relations one. Canada has a vital interest in world peace, which does kind of, again, with mixed success, presuppose or preempt the later Canadian spearheading of things like the Peace Corps, right? The Casque Bleu, right? Are they just called the Blue Helmets? No, there's no way.
I have no idea. I just think it's funny. Casque Bleu.
Okay. The UN Peacekeeping Task Force or whatever.
Yeah. No, they're Blue Helmets.
Yeah, okay, so the Blue Helmets. Okay. For some reason, I only ever heard it in French. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is an interesting and engaging piece of history that both sees the seeds of future projects and provides a kind of mixed bag of lost futures that never saw the light of day.
I think it's interesting in the way that it's not talked about. This is something you're not going to see on any curriculum,
Right.
And I think that's really telling about because of the fact because it does like parts of it did work, and it's like again to put my tinfoil hat on, it's very much powers that be don't want you to know that these things worked or where these things came from, socialized electricity didn't come out of nowhere.
Absolutely. I think part of that is also because the CCF and NDP were always successful more provincially than federally.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to some of these things, right, that when they start small and then expand out to the wider public federally, right, like the socialized healthcare, for example, right, because there've only ever been two parties in power in Canada, liberals and conservatives, people don't imagine that it was another party that could have thought of something like this, right? So, like, I think that the very way that our political system works stops people from imagining that, even if it's not necessarily the education system that's like stopping you from thinking of it. Because like nothing's stopping a teacher from telling you about this, but I don't think it helps that we've only ever had two parties in power.
Oh, 100%. The whole like multi-party, it's a bit of a myth.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't know. The last thing I wanted to say is kind of a segue into the early days of the CCF section that I wanted to talk about, is that as this manifesto kind of indicates, what they're going for with this project is very much a mix of different target audiences. They're trying to target farmers, obviously, with the agricultural stuff, but also your common laborer and also people who work in industry and healthcare, right? They're really trying to appeal to literally anyone who's not a millionaire, because we weren't talking about billionaires at the time.
Which is also very much reflected in the writing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you have a good example of it?
Well, just in general, when you read this, like, it's very direct. We've read other political documents on this show before, most famously probably the Indigenous treaties, which were designed and written in such a way as to be very confusing, very, like, even when translated, would still not make sense without a deep understanding of politics. Because, again, the goal was to trick. Like, this literally says, to counteract the worst effect of this, the internal price level should be raised so that the farmer's purchasing power may be restored. Direct, straight to the point, lays out exactly what it wants to say. There's no like trying to trick anybody. There's no fancy way. It's just boom. Here it is. This is what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, leaving just enough to the imagination so that people can grasp at something larger than themselves. And I'll take like another early sentence. It being the CCF is a democratic movement, a federation of farmers, labor, and socialist organizations, financed by its own members and seeking to achieve its ends solely by constitutional methods, right? Like, obviously, it's an early passage that they're going to develop later, but just this idea of a federation of various groups, right? The term is not explained of federation, what that entails, but it leaves enough in people's minds that they're like, okay, well, what that would mean is that at least everyone, can act relatively independently, much like in Canada, in the provincial versus federal, but still ultimately work together, right? And again, it points to the title of the party itself, the name of the party, Co-operative Commonwealth, right? Everyone together for something, but still independent in his own goals. Right? So I think that's kind of interesting. And unfortunately, we're not good. I didn't ask you to read it for today. I maybe should have. One of the things I noted in the notes, I don't know if you saw that one, right? Like in the manifesto itself, it does say that no CCF government will rest content until it has eradicated capitalism. Like, strong words coming out swinging.
Yeah.
And like very quickly they dropped that one.
Well, because it's never gonna work. And again,
it's never gonna work
also
on its own.
Yeah, it's also you can't. Again, we have to pull the levers from everywhere a little bit. Capitalism is like not inherent. Like, yes, there are major problems with it at a fundamental level. Don't get me wrong, but the inherent idea of people need to compete with each other to create better goods is kind of true.
In some ways, absolutely. And it also points to the difficulty of achieving something like this in an otherwise capitalist world. Like, if only Canada had been, for example, this socialist country that the CCF was calling for, right? Like, especially with the US as its direct neighbor, good luck. Good luck doing anything, right? So like even historically, that would have been a very difficult thing to do. Right? That's not to say that they shouldn't have tried, or that you can't imagine a better future, whatever that may be. But yeah, their mitigation of those circumstances would be very evident in like subsequent pieces, which in later generations would call for more of a mixed economy, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which not quite the eradication of capitalism that the Regina Manifesto calls for. I don't know. Anything else you want to say on the manifesto before we get into like the early days of the CCF?
Anything else? No, I don't think so. I mean, there's also the fact we have to remember that like World War II is going to happen in 5 years, and that's going to totally like that just ruins everything.
As if everything wasn't already ruined with the Depression, it's just going to kick people while they're down.
That's true. They're going to kick
World War I, Depression, kicked in the balls.
World War II, more kicked in the balls.
So once the manifesto's out there, the party would very quickly like coalesce. There's that first national convention in Regina in 1933, and what's interesting is that unlike other socialist groups beforehand and even contemporary to the CCF, this one was much more led by academics and intellectuals, right? Which could think of these problems in more abstract terms, right? But they were working in conjunction with the farmers and workers that they were speaking for, right? So you did have that like really interesting balance, it seems, of well-written and well thought out, political statements, while still genuinely seeming to be for the average person. Right? And some people would actually criticize the CCF for this, for the same reason that we kind of criticize some parties today, right? Of just being the same old as any other party, right? Using technocrats and bureaucrats and academics to who are already quite successful to pretend to be for the people, right? But it seems at least like the CCF actually did want to do that, at least from what I read. Like they did seem genuine in their calls for this, but I don't know. That's just based on my readings. You looked like you were going to say something. Sorry,
a bit of a yawn. And this is just about what the manifesto itself says.
No, but or just like my readings of about the history of the CCF in general.
Oh, I mean, I think you're right. It's any kind of. We were talking about it a bit beforehand, I'm pretty sure, in a similar way when we were talking about The Nightmare Before Christmas and counterculture. And the problem is, like, once you get adopted into the culture, you are no longer counterculture. Once you get adopted into the establishment, you can no longer be anti-establishment. And I think that's partially why they had to drop lines like the bring about the downfall of capitalism.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Because they were already getting adopted by, you don't want to say corrupted by, but they were getting people were becoming part of their system that were very obviously capitalist. And they were saying, hey, this is kind of important to us,
Exactly. I wonder then, like, why it would have. I guess that's one of the reasons why it was more successful provincially, especially in those early days, is because they were appealing very specifically to that base of farmers, especially in the prairies, who were being hit extremely hard by the Depression, right? And so you had that like concentration of people who supported them and made them so. Yeah.
Well, it's also a difference in issues. Provincially, you have a very different mindset. Provincially, you're looking much more domestically at your issues. You're looking much more just like whereas federally, you have a lot more to consider due to the international obligations.
Exactly.
And people are, how do I say this correctly? I find at a provincial, usually at a state level, people are usually more willing to get into the idea of helping their neighbor. And they're more willing to give up their money, their time, their things. And so I think that's why these more socialist policies worked at a provincial level, is because it's a much smaller community.
Yeah. And that's often, by the way, like what you see in a lot of like calls for social movements, whatever they may call themselves, right, tend to be very, very localized, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, like I'm one of those people who like tends to imagine a future in which we are much more small in our communities and much more localized. And if something like a large state like Canada exists, it's like a coalition of these very small communities rather than like some big uncaring state, right?
Yeah, and
Which I think there
there's
is like some kind of basis for those ideas.
oh, there is some credit to that, and there's some, and again, that's again why it succeeds, because it's just it's easier to do that. They aren't faceless to you, and again, there's less dividing lines. It's one
It's
thing
more
to say
accountability
that,
too.
yeah, more accountability. It's one thing to say that those damn Manitobans are getting some of my hard-earned Quebec money. It's much different to
Sure.
be
Yeah.
like those, oh, okay, I'll help out my friends in Quebec City with my Montreal money, because we're all Quebecois at the end of the day. Like there's less dividing lines, there's less division, and so and I think historically we get to see that tracks that a lot of these more left leaning will always do better, because take for example in Quebec, like the Conservative Party does not exist at a provincial level.
But
No, but like it barely gets, and it has barely any power to it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think you'd probably see that in a lot of places. Or if you look at a lot of even in the US, a lot of the states now, state governments are flipping, even if federally they still are very much hardline conservative.
Exactly. And you do start to see that here as well, where you're starting to see like a push back provincially against conservative governments that were in the Maritimes or places like Saskatchewan, actually. Yeah.
Even as the conservative government is setting themselves up for a big win federally.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, for sure. And so what's kind of interesting is like to piggyback off of what you were saying, like from the outset in those early days, the CCF would basically create these small caucuses a little bit everywhere that were made up of MPs from different labor groups. So, for example, we talked about one of them when we talked about the Winnipeg strike, right? J.S. Woodsworth was a prominent Christian socialist who was also metal as fuck because he was arrested during the Winnipeg strike and was a really cool politician. But also like other semi-independent groups like what's called the Ginger Group, which was like a more left-leaning part of the Progressive Party, which had emerged in the 1920s. So all of these groups and caucuses would kind of be semi-independent while still working alongside the CCF, right? Which very much comes to what we were saying, right? That there's these localized forces that slowly but surely are creating constellations of power, if you will, rather than a cooperative. Right? And I think that's what kind of made the CCF stand out, right? Prospective members seem to join affiliates, right, whose structure and ideology varied very considerably from one to another. And so, but what that also led to is sometimes some classic leftist infighting that we still see today.
It wouldn't be a leftist party if there wasn't infighting.
Right. So like things like the United Farmers of Ontario, which by the way, their acronym is UFO, which is funny.
10 out of 10 acronym.
Yep. Bravo. Like they would very quickly leave because they were not as radical as the CCF was kind of seeming to be to them. Classic Ontario, by the way, for being cowards.
No, I just love the idea of not being radical enough.
Right. Sorry, the United Farmers were not as radical, I should say.
I know that's funny to me because this idea of like,
right,
we need to burn down the system, we need to break this, blah blah blah, and the farmers are just like, dude, I just want to make a living, I just want to like get by right now.
Which, by the way, like even the CCF were like, we don't want violence, we just want to do this democratically. So even then, they were like, we want to change the system, of course, but we want to do it like through progressive change. So the radical is like a very much a small r radical in this.
The left, always a fun time.
Say what you will, they are always worth an interesting conversation.
Yeah, good old X-Men.
Yeah, exactly. So what's kind of interesting is that also as the CCF grew, right, and became a federal party, and I think still to this day that's true with the NDP, you do see quite a bit of difference between the provincial CCF and the federal CCF. Like the two would remain relatively autonomous one from the other, which I don't think is quite true even today with things like the conservative and liberals. They tend to both provincially and federally follow themselves quite closely, right? With the exception, again, maybe being Quebec and British Columbia a little bit, I would say. But generally speaking, like the Liberal and Conservative parties, both provincial and federal, stay very close to one another. Whereas the CCF and now the NDP, I would say, like, do differ quite a bit, both provincially and federally. I don't know about you, but if you agree with that, but yeah, I don't know. I think that's an interesting thing. But yeah, anyway, like those early days, as you might expect for the CCF, were yeah, all right. Like it varied greatly. We'll say that. Like it skyrocketed in places like BC and Saskatchewan. They would be very quickly the official opposition, and they would eventually be elected in Saskatchewan itself, right, in the late 1930s and early 40s. But in other places, they didn't quite hold up, right? In Alberta, they had a little bit more difficulty for a bit because there were other parties like Social Credit that also took up that populist mantle and didn't and were quite successful over the CCF. Or other places like Ontario and Quebec that they never quite got in.
Yeah, because they're not French. That's why they never got into Quebec.
But also in Quebec at this time in the 1930s, you were talking about Duplessis. It's pretty much smack in this era in like the late 1930s and 40s. They weren't getting in regardless.
Yeah.
Nobody
can break into Quebec. An impenetrable wall of poutine. It's a block. You're right. Damn it, that's the best joke ever on this podcast. That was good.
Thank you.
Another banger.
So, but basically, like the Second World War, and this is where we'll stop in the early days of the CCF, the World War II dramatically affected them because while they claimed in the Regina Manifesto that they were a peace-loving party, it would very much they would kind of change their tune with World War II because they were like, yeah, but fascism though. That's a worthy reason to go to war is fascism.
Yeah.
Which we're seeing groups here in Canada be a bit fashy. We're going to talk about that in a couple of episodes, but there's straight up fascism in Europe. Let's support the fight for that. Yeah, exactly. So that kind of changed their tune, but what it did especially was make them even more popular. So after the war, in places like Western Canada, they would really solidify themselves as a proper party and a more mainstream party, which arguably is the beginning of the end, but they would still have a couple of decades in them in the 50s and 60s.
Never become a mainstream party.
All my homies hate mainstream parties.
What are you going to be next to Justin Trudeau?
Exactly.
Most wonder-bred limp-ass white man ever.
Was the most brutal takedown. Wonder-bred limp-ass, right?
That's what he is. Like, I voted for the man, but come on. Like, I think he's better than a lot of people give him credit for, but still, come on.
Yeah. So all of this, of course, is happening in the backdrop of the Great Depression, right? Max Depression, as it's called today. Yeah. It's the updated. Yes, exactly. There's a few textbooks that have started to change it, actually. It's quite impressive.
They're mostly the ones Patrick sells to his class, but that's okay.
Can you imagine
food on the table?
What a power move that would be if I just start telling my students that it's also known as Max Depression and they start to adopt it.
We're starting a revolution, baby.
I was
thinking about it, and I wonder if, how big do we have to be for me to get an honorary PhD from somewhere?
Like we would have to be a lot bigger than
I know, but I feel like that's a reasonable goal to have. Get big enough for Mackenzie to get an honorary PhD.
That would be very funny. I would push for that.
The same way, okay, if Taylor Swift can get an honorary PhD in whatever, I think I can too.
Does she really?
Yeah, they all get one because whenever they go speak at that, I know The Rock has one because again they go and speak at those universities with their valedictorian, whatever, and they get offered like the.
Ooh, gross. Anyway, I'm curious. Like, have you ever heard of the On-To-Ottawa Trek that happened during the Great Depression?
No.
Okay.
Was it anything like the Ontario Trucker Riot, the Great Ontario
I
Trucker
hate that
Riot of 2019?
making that comparison. Yes and no. It's
It's
not
complicated.
as fascist. It's not fascist, if that's what you're saying. But it is. It was a convoy that headed to Ottawa.
Let's go.
So I guess that's something.
It's
So
something.
do you know anything? We'll start there. Do you know anything about the relief camps that were set up during the Depression by the government?
I imagine they were camps to help relieve the people.
Yes. In what way exactly? Like, do you know what they were doing or anything like that in the camps?
No. I can take guesses, but no specific. No, I don't know.
But if you look at the caricatures that I linked in the show,
yes.
You'll get like some sense of what some people.
Oh dear Lord! Oh no.
I'll link them in the show notes for people to like actually see them alongside us. So this one is specifically one that's critical of
Oh dear.
So the way that this caricature image, it's not a caricature, it's a drawing in this case, is depicting it. I guess the only thing I can think of is like Gulag would be the closest comparison. Which is not entirely unfounded. Like, it basically faced similar criticisms, right? In the sense that the conditions in which people were placed in were very poor. They ultimately made very little money and were doing very, very hard work, right? And were not really fed as much as they were promised, right? So the comparison here is perhaps surprising to a lot of people, but surprisingly apt. Yeah. And so this is where the On-To-Ottawa Trek starts, right? Because, as you might expect, people were not happy.
Shocker!
Yeah. Like, obviously you can say, like, beggars can't be choosers, and everyone was a beggar in the Depression. But also, if you're going to set up a camp that claims to give relief,
it has to actually give relief.
Yeah, like, otherwise you're just forcing people to labor for nothing, right? That's
just slave labor.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Slave labor is extra steps at the moment.
That's literally it. So it's not exactly the great place to start. And it was yet another reason why people were critical of the Bennett government, is because they pulled shit like this, right?
Everybody's driving around in their Bennett mobiles. What do they call them? Bennett wagon.
The Bennett buggy. Yeah.
Bennett buggy, that's it. I'm going to call it the Bennett mobile.
Yeah.
Slavery!
Mobile hadn't been invented yet, so I don't think it would have been like a neologism.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. So basically all of this culminated in 1935. So like 2 years after the Regina Manifesto started to coalesce, laborers and workers and,
Regina.
And it all is going to come back because this episode's going to finish in Regina as well. It started there, it's going to finish there as well. It's almost
Regina
like it was
started
planned.
This episode, and it can finish it too. God damn it!
It can take us out of this world as well.
Regina brought us into this world. Regina can take it out. I swear to God, we're intellectuals. I swear to God, we're actually smart people.
Promise I have a master's and almost a PhD.
I'm put in charge of children.
So am I.
Yours are technically adults.
Well, I don't know. Technically is a big term. Yours is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah. So basically, the On-To-Ottawa Trek is not quite the same as the Ottawa convoy that you're referring to. They did not go in trucks to Ottawa because they didn't have any gas.
Weren't a thing yet, really.
I mean, yeah, not quite. Not 18-wheelers, that's for sure. But they basically started in British Columbia, where a lot of relief camps were, and they decided to walk and take the train and other means of public transit in order to go all the way to Ottawa. Now, as you might expect, there's a lot of distance to cover between British Columbia and Ottawa. So you have a lot of time to pick up a lot of people who have nothing better to do than to go to Ottawa and fuck shit up.
You also gotta get through the mountains, but it's fine.
For sure. But by then, like the train had been created. Like you got it, all those mountains are exploded. It's fine.
It's fine.
And basically, the original purpose of the trek was to petition and put pressure on the federal government to protest the conditions in the camps and protest even further cuts that those camps were facing. So they were already poor and they got even less money. Sounds like the education system, but whatever.
Dang, Patrick, here with the hot take.
Yeah, all the time. That's why I have a podcast, is to make lukewarm takes.
Lukewarm,
whatever.
Milkwarm. What kind of milk are you drinking?
I'm also tired. Whatever. I was thinking of a different
Regina, if you ask me.
Oh god. And basically, like I was saying, it made its way eastward from British Columbia. But what happens is that when you start off with, in April of 1935, already 1,500 people leaving a relief camp, that's a lot of people, first of all, that are just marching. But you already obviously pick up people as you're going, to the point where there was an estimated 3,000, I think, by the end. There were 1,000 strikers, and then it doubled. Yeah, so about 2,000 to 3,000 people, more or less, depending on the estimates. Like, people kind of rile themselves up, right? They kind of talk to each other. They're, very much exchanging ideas about the situation. But it's important to keep in mind that while discontent was rising, apparently the march was always peaceful, right? That they never broke stuff or anything like that, or at least not intentionally. It was always a peaceful march that was meant to put pressure, not actually just destroy stuff. But of course, the government would not necessarily see it that way, right?
They never do.
Right. And very quickly, they framed these protesters and these marchers as thieves, right? Who were stealing, first of all, CPR tickets, right? They were riding the train for free towards Ottawa. How dare they, right? Thieves they are.
Thieves. Dang, unions.
Right, exactly. Which, that's a good segue. It was very much led by union organizers. The most important one being Arthur Slim Evans, who was a Workers' Unity League official, right? And pretty much the head of the On-To-Ottawa Trek. He was a very famous union organizer who's also quite cool. You can look it up on Wikipedia or whatever. He has a really colorful history. And apparently he was a great orator and speaker. There's a reason why he was at the head of a lot of these union movements, is because he was able to rally people around these causes extremely effectively. Right? So shout out to my boy Slim Evans, which is the perfect 1935 name. But anyway.
Hey, Slim, what are you doing here? Will the real Slim Evans please stand up?
Thank you. That's
Slim,
what I was waiting for. I guess we'll all be happy. We'll go home to Kamloops.
Oh, for sure there, bud.
So, basically Bennett would frame, with such things as calling them thieves and communists, of course, right? Bennett would frame the Trekkers as insurrectionists, right? And you had very much two competing narratives that had formed by the time the Trekkers reached Regina. One was, of course, the one that was started by the people who were marching and the people that were helping them. They were very much helped by Christian organizations and labor organization, women who were staying at home most of the time, right? All of these people helped the Trekkers in their protest. And on the other side, you had the government position, which was that these people were radicals hell-bent on destroying the federal government. And that kind of came to a head in Regina, where Bennett and Evans met. Right? And apparently it was not the kindest meeting that could have happened. I don't think there's any records, like official records of it left, but apparently it ended in acrimony where, Bennett called Evans a thief and Evans called Bennett a liar and all kinds of stuff. So just insulting each other one after the other. It didn't lead to anything. So basically, it's a modern political debate. And there were like some conferences that would be held with provincial leaders or municipal leaders, but basically everyone passed the ball along to the other. They were like, "Oh no, it's that other guy that needs to take care of it," and
Oh no.
whatever. Right. And Bennett, in his infinite wisdom, decided on July 1st, Dominion Day of all days, that the best solution to this problem would be to do what, Mac, to the protesters? What do you think he did?
Sit down, have an honest discussion, really, take the peaceful route. Remember that these are your people, they're your electorates, you need to treat them well, make smart decisions so that he can stay in power, and so that his political rival wouldn't be able to, jump on him and take back power quickly, and just be overall really smart and respectful and kind, I think.
Okay. Now, what did he actually do?
You're saying that's not what he did?
No.
Let me guess. He used the goddamn RCMP.
Oh, yeah. Not just the RCMP, the city police, too, of course.
Of course.
To break up those gathering strikers and citizens and protesters who were standing around.
ACAB, people. ACAB. Even the ones from Paw Patrol.
Especially the ones from Paw Patrol. So, because the police were sent in, a violent clash ensued because it was not,
of course,
peaceful, right? So they came in with revolvers firing and tear gas bombs shooting, all kinds of stuff. And basically the trekkers were fighting back with sticks and stones.
Mm-hmm.
Not going to be a great combination.
No.
Especially not on Dominion Day, right, which we now know as Canada Day, but yeah, not a great look. And after all of that, right, after all that Regina rioting going on, hundreds were wounded. About 130 people were estimated to have been arrested, and only one police officer was dead.
Right.
So, it kind of shows the scale of what was happening. And I'll give you another chance to redeem yourself after your question on Bennett. There was an inquiry into the riot and the ensuing bloodbath and brutality. Where do you think the blame was placed of this federal inquiry? Was it placed on Bennett, on the cops, on the trekkers? Who do you think got the blame, Matt?
Interesting. Who do I think got the blame? I mean, as the Prime Minister of Canada, obviously Bennett would have had to take some of the blame, It's his country. I would hope that he would be responsible and hold himself accountable for his actions. And I would also hope that the police would understand that they didn't live up to their duty to protect and serve and their duty to protect the citizens of their nation, the RCMP especially. I hope that they would go back and restructure their organization, maybe.
Final answer?
Yep, final answer. Locking it in.
Wrong. The trekkers were dirty communists that needed to be beat up.
God damn it. Well, I was close.
Close.
I was so close.
Ties back in when we were talking about on last episode the 10 lost years, right? They were one of the characters. I forget who was saying, like, they labeled us as certain things and as Reds, and they just tore through us. That's what he's referring to, right? Is this moment when people felt betrayed by their own government that they were peacefully protesting. Yeah. And Bennett would feel the brunt of that, at least in some sense, because he would be voted out of office that same year. People did not stand for his shenanigans much longer. And that's when King came back as a political leader. By the way, just to tie it into the cultural element of it, there are two things I wanted to mention. There's a whole novel by Irene Baird called Waste Heritage, which does fictionalize events that are similar to what I just described. I think she inspired herself from the On-To-Ottawa Trek, but I don't think based on the novel that it was actually the On-To-Ottawa Trek in the context of the novel. It was a similar form of discontent. It's an excellent novel and not talked about enough.
Let's go.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention it as if readers are interested, do it. Great. It's a fantastic novel. I think it's published by U of Ottawa Press now.
Let's go.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything that you wanted to add about any of this? I felt like I did more of the talking in this second half, but I don't know.
No, I think. I mean, it's a history section right now, and it's just trying to.
Yeah.
I think we have to understand why, as these types of groups and organizations tend to do, why they usually end up falling apart, failing, becoming irrelevant. And I think it just relates back to this large idea that there is not a place for them eventually. You can't be against society or against the establishment the whole time, because eventually you will, as we've been saying, become the society, become the establishment.
The caricature that I put in, did you see the other one that I linked?
On-To-Ottawa, special privileges, campaign expenses, public support.
I feel like part of that, this caricature kind of talks about what you're saying, right? Where people were discontent with how people got into power, right? So you have people like Bennett or even the CCF on some level who, are able to cop some of the difficulties of campaign expenses through public support and on some level special privileges because they have some kind of connection to the political world or because they have a long-standing history within it and that kind of thing. And so a group like the CCF and these people who are trekking onto Ottawa were very much protesting and representing, lack of faith in this system that very much disadvantages the underdog, right? And I think you're right in saying that eventually the CCF would kind of turn into that by the very nature of its position, right? But yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Do you have any final thoughts on this episode in general? Anything we talked about, anything we brought up? We've already been talking for an hour and some.
Yeah, no, I think we've hit on all the main points. I think we've sort of yeah. No,
All
I
right.
think we've.
I don't know.
I don't think there's much else we can say at this point besides the fact that I'm happy that a lot of these projects and parts did live on, and I think that speaks to its success.
And I will link, by the way, to another short story that's published in the Globe and Mail by Guy Vanderhaeghe, which
We're all right.
fictionalizes. Yeah, we're all right. Which fictionalizes the Regina riot. So yeah, that was a good one. I don't think we should talk about it just because the episode's long enough. But yeah, I don't know. It's good. It's a good short story if people want a fictional account of that. Yeah. Anyway, support us on Patreon. Do all that good stuff. Leave us a 5-star review. Oh, we should do a Pop Canada soon as well.
Yeah, we should get a Pop Canada soon.
Yeah, when I come back from Halifax.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. That's it.
So,
What a
love
fizzled out
you
ending.
guys. We love our fans.
I love you all. Hey. Thanks for
Bye.
sticking by our nonsense jokes on Regina.
It's pronounced Regina. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Pardon my French.
God, you stupid American tourist.
It's everywhere.
All right, bye.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Mielke. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.